everyone, and welcome to Lecture 5 on Values and Valuing. This week's teaching assistant is called Darcy. I would show you Darcy in person, except he is my current foster cat and he has crawled into the ceiling of my basement. I'm pretty sure this is him getting back at me for taking him to get neutered on Monday. Hopefully, Darcy will come out of the ceiling in time for his next vet appointment and checkup. Till then, let's talk about what values are. So values are our guides to behavior. They're the principles that we hold as worthy and good, but they're not actually provable truths, right? They vary from person to person. And they're created and derived from experience and history. They're shared by a population or a group, and they provide a means for organizing and structuring patterns of behavior. We learn them from our experiences in families and communities and other social groups. As a result, they're emergent and dynamic. They are both shaping our world and they shape our beliefs as we experience the world. They are also deeply embedded in our political, social, and economic institutions. So the values we have change with the policies and economic situations that we're in. As a result, they're very much ideologically based. So our beliefs about what is true is very much dependent on who we are and where we are. And they're the screens through which we interpret actions and give meaning to our experience. Consider from a few weeks ago how we talked about the value-based judgments given to the worthy versus unworthy poor, and at the time, the ability to be employed and to have work was the topmost value by which people were judged. And they were rated quite pseudoscientifically on it, with the value argument being that depending on a person's ethnicity or national origin, they had different values. Think about your own core values, so your ways of being and doing that you hold to be good and desirable. We're going to discuss this during this week's discussions. So try considering it during this lecture. How have your experiences shaped your values? Who's been responsible for this shaping? Was it your family, your community, your religion? What messages did you receive as you were growing up about values and valuing? Which of these values have you embraced and which of these have you resisted or rejected? Are there competing values that you struggle with? What are some of the value-laden issues and debates that provoke an emotional reaction for you? And how do your personal values relate to the values of the social work profession? So consider all of these questions as we start talking about values within the American context and within social work more specifically. So Coles came up with a list of 13 American values. So his theory was that if you presented this list of values to somebody who was visiting America, they would be able to make sense of Americans and American culture. And Coles argued that even though Americans see themselves as unique individuals who choose their values, these 13 values are deeply ingrained in the American way of life. Would you agree with these values? Do you think they capture what it means to be American? Who counts as American according to these values? Whose America might be missing from this list of values? Are these values potentially linked to whiteness and white privilege? For instance, let's examine how many of these values are informed by neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is the free market capitalism, right? It's looking at economic liberalization. What that means is that we want to privatize deregulate and globalize market forces through things like free trade, and reduce government spending through austerity measures in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and society. And the theory behind neoliberalism is that if the market is strong enough, there will be a trickle-down effect and the entire population will benefit. So highlighted in red here, we see how many of these American values are very much in line with the neoliberalism values, which unfortunately tends to leave out a large portion of the population. Capitalism very much depends on a cheap working class to fulfill many employment roles that are undervalued and underpaid. So you can understand how some of these values might not coincide well with social justice values. And this leads us to also think about Marxism. So Marxism is basically the alternative to capitalism, and this was developed by Karl Marx. His philosophy is really that in order for individuals to have joy and dignity, they have to have control over the fruits of their labor. So they have to be involved in not just the production of the labor, but also all the money that gets made from it. So in the Marxist approach, a worker would also have stake in the company. So as the company succeeds, the worker also succeeds and gets bonuses from that, as opposed to all the bonuses going to CEOs and shareholders, and the workers are left with minimum wage. Consider also the values that we have for families and with our families. What does family mean to you? How are your definitions similar to when you were a child versus how do you understand family now? How do experiences in families shape values? For instance, let's consider the temporary assistance for needy families. So the welfare system within the United States. It's very much a proponent of two-member families as the best, and it penalizes single parents without acknowledging any of the structural forces that prevent the formation of two-parent families, such as the high rate of incarceration of Black men, leading to many single Black women having to raise their children. And it's also, TANF doesn't recognize that sometimes families can have alternative structures that can be equally successful. So while research does tell us that two-parent families have the most successful children in terms of the child's economic and educational success, other studies indicate that if the child's parent has the income equal to two-parent families and the social supports, they can fare just as well. So it's not necessarily the fact that it's the single parent that's the issue, it's poverty that's very much playing a factor there. And we're punishing people for being poor and single as opposed to supporting them and recognizing that it's more difficult to provide the same level of resources when you're a single parent. We should also think about some of the common expressions that are communicated in our families and that teach us our values. I'm sure many of us have heard things like boys don't cry or that's not ladylike as we were growing up. So think about what values we internalized from that. And from that, what have we questioned and resisted, and how have our values changed over time? Consider some of the messages that you received, not just about gender, but about race and racism as you are growing up, and social class. Who were these messages from? For instance, something that's going through social media right now is very much the ageist rhetoric between millennials, Gen X, and the boomer population. But is that really who is to blame for the current high rates of poverty, or is it very much a social class issue as opposed to an age and generational issue. Let's now quickly look at the social work core values. We'll discuss these in more detail next week when we go over the Code of Ethics. But basically, we have 7 values that are enshrined in the American Social Work Code of Ethics, and that's competence, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, service, and social justice. These are not sorted in order of importance. These are just alphabetical here. Consider, though, that some of these values contradict each other or can be, how do you say, difficult to realize at the same time. There's tensions between them. Like, for instance, integrity. So social workers must behave in a trustworthy manner. How do we realize that core value when some of our policies require things like mandatory reporting? So in the event that a client is suicidal or confesses to committing a crime against a child, we must report that by state and federal law. So how do we deal with this inherent tension between these values? Consider your own practice or work site. How are the values manifested in the routines, rules, and practices that you have in your workplaces? Are these implicit expressions of values aligned with the stated values of the organization? So are they actually doing what they say they're going to do in their mission and value statement? Or is the mission and value statement just there for the funders, and what's actually going on in practice is quite different? Consider, for instance, the tension between the value of competence and high caseload. So the value of competence requires us to constantly keep abreast of the research literature so that we're using the most effective interventions possible with our clients. But when do social workers have time to update their knowledge if they have very high caseloads assigned by their organizations, or the organization doesn't provide time for training on the latest research, and social workers are expected to do the research themselves on their own time? That's why in this week's discussion, we're going to consider what our values are and how they align with social work values. A lot of value definition happens through dialogue with others. So we're going to respectfully discuss how we can respond to discrepancies between our own personal values and the social work values. I'll give you an example. One of my values is the importance of the environment. So anything that can slow down pollution or environmental degradation is of huge importance to me. However, I need to recognize that this value is not going to be very important to most of my clients in child protection work. They're just struggling to survive and to care for their children. They don't have time to worry about the environment. I come from a great position of privilege, and that's what allows me to have time to worry about the environment, because I don't need to worry about how to put food in my child's mouth. So the way I respond to this discrepancy in values is to keep the environmental justice value to myself and focus on the value of the client in those situations.